This is Paul Schneiderman today on the 37th edition of Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio. Today I have a very special guest. I have an author, speaker, commentator, and Washington State University professor, Dr. David J. Leonard. Professor, I'm going to go back to you and describe you further in a minute. Just want to give a couple plugs for my station. Today I have James Gerd as my producer. I want to mention there's a lot of great things going on here at Rainier Avenue Radio. We're based in Seattle on the World Wide Web. Our sports department also has Rick Dupree's great show, One-on-One with Dupe. Granville Emerson and Ronald Laurent, also known as Pepe Bean, are the co-hosts of a fun show, Lidline Sports. Masvita Marari is the host of Seattle Sports Weekly. Mark Bryant is a fitness-based show. And Pat McCarthy is hosting this new sports show about the Seattle Metro Conference. Well, Professor Leonard, I'm going to give you more of an introduction here. Professor Leonard's been at Washington State University since about 2008. He works as a professor.
Actually, 2002.
2002, I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
That's all right.
You work in the Department of Critical Culture, Gender, and Race Studies. You got your PhD from Berkeley. You got your undergraduate degree at UC Santa Barbara. I believe you also got a master's degree, Professor, at UC Berkeley. Professor Leonard has written extensively on the cultural and ethnic aspects of sports. He's published several books that include African Americans on Television, Racing for Ratings, After Our Test, the NBA and the Assault on Blackness, Commodified and Criminalized New Racism in African Americans in Contemporary Sports. I just finished Professor Leonard's 2017 book that's generated a lot of publicity, Plain While White, Privilege and Power on and off the Field. Very interesting book. It gives the reader a lot of perspectives, whether you agree or disagree with all of it. Professor, today we're going to learn more about your work, your career, and we're going to get your thoughts about all sorts of stuff involving race and culture. We're not going to get anything today. We're going to have a fun conversation. Well, Professor Dr. David Leonard, thank you for coming on Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio.
Thank you. I'll give one correction.
Please do.
One of the realities of higher education these days is our academics' homes are changing constantly. We change more than sports teams move conferences in college sports, and so I'm now actually our department became a school, and we're the School of Languages, Cultures, and Race. But I appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited to be here on the 37th episode, which I think is fitting, given that Meta World Peace, formerly Ron Artest, was number 37, and so it fits with the book I wrote entitled After Our Test. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I love the coincidences of life, and I've been doing the show now since July of 2017 and learning by doing. And, we're going to have a fun discussion today, Professor, but a pretty serious discussion about race and sports. It's not all going to be about going to the beach and the joys of eating macaroni and cheese. We're going to get into some serious stuff. I think it's going to be very fun and provocative. Well, Professor Leonard, as discussed in the introduction, you received your PhD from UC Berkeley, and you've had a special focus on comparative ethnic studies. Tell us what led you to embark in this very interesting journey where you've had a special focus on race and privilege in the world of sports.
And this is a many-hour story that kind of traces my trajectory. But I will say I had a series of experiences that shaped not only my academic trajectory, but my kind of personal journey. And those, included being mentored by a variety of people, including Dr. Harry Edwards. And so when I was at UC Berkeley, I had the opportunity to work with him, and he was one of the first people to kind of bridge my work on race, on the history of racism in this country, and that interest. Again, long story, but when I went off to the University of Oregon, I had a series of experiences where I began to think about race and inequality, and then I quickly returned back to Los Angeles right around the LA uprising in 1992, and these kind of set me on the pathway. And then when I got to UC Berkeley, Harry introduced me to a world of sports sociology. And I actually didn't do my grad work in sports studies, but when I got to Washington State, I had a mentor here who was doing work on race and sports, and it kind of set me on that pathway. And I think, as you noted in the introduction, this is serious conversations, and the importance of sports and the history of race and sports points to what we can do in our writing and our teaching through sports. And so I think these important conversations can be had in relationship to sports, and that's part of my work.
Well, very interesting background, and you mentioned a very well-known sociologist, Dr. Harry Edwards. And for my listeners, Dr. Edwards has written a lot on sports and sociology, so thank you for sharing your connection to a very well-known man, Harry Edwards. Well, David, this is something we hear a lot. We hear a lot of people say this. They say, well, African-American athletes and people of color in the major U.S. sports leagues are making a lot of money, getting great endorsement deals. A lot of people say, where is the racism in sports when you have athletes of color getting good endorsements, making a lot of money? What's your response to that general comment you hear from people?
Well, I guess I would say that race and racism shapes every institution in our lives, and so it would be naive, as well as historically inaccurate, and certainly outside of countless research to say that, well, race matters in these other places, but not in sports.
Right.
It matters in the language that we hear, the descriptors of athletes. It matters in terms of access to different sports. When we look at, for example, the high schools in various cities, and then compare them to the high schools in suburbs, and thinking about how race and class operate in these spaces, and then look at what sports are available in these spaces. Race matters there. It matters in terms of who are the coaches, who are the general managers, who are the owners. It matters in the many ways that stereotypes persist, and how that shapes, what many sports scholars will talk about in terms of positional segregation. So the ascendants, and I'll just end with the example of the ascendant, actually the ways that we want to cite Michael Jordan, the popularity of Michael Jordan, or the success of Tiger Woods, or the storied career of Serena Williams, speaks to how race operates, because these sort of their careers and their place within not only sports culture but society as large become a moment where we as a society want to say, look, race doesn't matter. Look, we're beyond race. Never mind their own experiences. Never mind the larger realities of race. But the fact that we cite their ascendance and their success and their financial place as evidence of colorblindness, of post-raciality, is really evidence of how race matters. Just as people wanted to cite the 2008 election as evidence that race no longer matters, that the election of Barack Obama proved that we'd moved beyond race, didn't prove that. And I guess I would say those sort of arguments have kind of fallen on their face in recent years. And so I think it's an important reminder to think about why we want to cite these examples as proof of post-racism, rather than addressing the persistent ways that race shapes not only the playing fields, but the press boxes and society as a whole.
Do you see, Professor, do you see sports in America any less race neutral than other industries and, I don't know, events in America?
It's a hard question to answer because race is so integral and central both historically and today to every institution. And so it plays out in different ways. It matters, how it manifests itself in Hollywood. We just think pop culture of Hollywood versus television versus sport is going to be different, but race matters. Not only matters in terms of its organization, in terms of how we talk about it, but it's what it teaches us about race, what it teaches us about the history of racism, and so I think it's hard to think about it in those terms, and I think we have to kind of push ourselves to think like, what are the connections between these different institutions? What does it mean that if we look at the descriptors of football players, both by media commentators but also in scouting guides, are racially distinct, that the way in which black football players and white football players and Pacific Islander football players are described are distinctly different. What does it mean when we look at how those descriptions shape schooling, shape job employment, shape the criminal justice system? And so I think it's important to look at those linkages and to think about how our stereotypes and our language seeps into these different spaces.
Well, a lot of stuff there, Professor. We're not going to solve in this interview. A lot of fascinating stuff. This is Paul Schneiderman, host of Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio with noted sports author and professor Dr. David Leonard. Professor, in your book, Plain While White, which I finished this week, very interesting book. I recommend it for my listeners. Came out in 2017. And you frequently use the hash mark term, plain while white, in your book. Can you tell my listeners what you mean by plain while white?
So the book came out when sorry, I'm hearing an echo.
You're fine.
So when I started writing the book, I was thinking a lot about racial profiling. And so I was connecting to these larger discussions about driving while black. And so I wanted to think about how we tell stories, how we narrate sports. And so the idea of playing while white was a way to talk about privilege and the way in which we describe and narrate the experience of white athletes.
So do you generally feel then, Professor, that a white athlete has most of the time more advantages than an athlete of color? Does that come with playing time issues? Expand on that a little bit, Professor.
Well, the book is mostly talking about media narratives. So the way, for example, I have one chapter that talks about leadership.
Right.
And the ways that media commentators and media stories will talk about leadership in particular ways for white athletes. That will, for example, celebrate Tom Brady yelling at his teammates as evidence of his competitiveness or evidence of his leadership in ways that black athletes are not afforded. And so those are the kind of privileges that I'm talking about. We could certainly talk about the history of positional segregation in football and basketball, the way in which black athletes have historically been stacked into certain positions. We could talk about, as I mentioned before, white athletes or white students really having access to sports like lacrosse and swimming in their high schools, and that we don't see the same diversity of sports in the high schools that are disproportionately and overwhelmingly Black and Latino X. So there are different ways that we can think about privilege. I mean, one of the other examples that I talk about is this idea of redemption, that white athletes, when we look historically and into today, that when white athletes have, whether it be on the field or off the field, indiscretions or even are accused of crimes or even convicted of crimes or misdeeds in sports or outside, there's a pathway for redemption, that it becomes a moment to talk about the comeback, to talk about second chances, to talk about growth. And so these are the ways that I want us to think about playing while white. And then just lastly, another example you can think of is the way in which we attribute intelligence, playing the right way, that, being a quote-unquote textbook basketball player becomes a way that we talk about white athletes in ways that we don't celebrate the intelligence or the athletic IQ or the IQ of Black athletes in the same way. And so these are all examples of the way in which whiteness results in privilege.
Well, you threw a lot out there. It's some fascinating stuff when I asked you that question about how you define plain while white. And I told you off the air a little bit that I play a little devil's advocate. Do you think there's some situations, David, in 2018, this era, where maybe a white basketball player, a white football player may be stigmatized?
Well, I mean, the question would be, are they stigmatized for their whiteness? And then we have to think about, like, what is the larger context? And so is it about their whiteness? Is that also connected to things that are privileged? So, for example, I talk about white wide receivers in the book who are often celebrated for their intelligence and being gritty and
right.
being hardworking and all sorts of, really racialized cliches. Part of that narrative is also denying them their athleticism, and saying that they don't, have speed. And so what we see with race is race operates through a binary. And so these ways that whiteness are imagined and blackness are imagined feed off one another. And so I guess we have to think of it in those terms. So the narratives are very much interconnected. I don't know if that answers that.
No, a lot of insights, a lot of good insights. You mentioned Tom Brady a minute ago, and you wrote about Tom Brady in your book, Plain While White. This is Paul Schneiderman of Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio with acclaimed author and professor David Leonard. And you write about Tom Brady in your book, and you suggest in your book that if Tom Brady were black, he would have been in worse shape. But there's no doubt Tom Brady definitely got punished. Is it your position he would have been punished worse for his allegations if he were a person of color?
I actually don't get into hypotheticals because I think they're a kind of a useless exercise.
Okay.
And so I guess the question is, I don't know because Tom Brady's life and his, whether it be his experiences in high school or his experiences, going through Michigan, like my experiences growing up in Los Angeles or going to Berkeley, they're all shaped by race. They're shaped by race and society. So whether he was punished or would have been punished differently, in absence of his whiteness. I mean, his whiteness shaped the discussion around Deflategate. It shaped how immediately thereafter there were individuals who were like, well, even if he violated the rule, it's a dumb rule. Or if he's going to be punished, he shouldn't be punished this much. Or those who said when he was punished, well, he was punished only to send a message that the league was going to punish its white star, given ways that the league has punished African American athletes. And so I think it's important to think about how race shaped so much of the reaction, and as well as the redemption that was afforded to him, or the way in which he was labeled as an underdog, and so Deflategate became part of this underdog story. And I don't know about you, but if you look at Tom Brady's story from the high school that he went to, in terms of having access to a quarterback coach, to being afforded a scholarship to University of Michigan, to being drafted, I wish I could be an underdog like that. I wish I could, and I'm sure there's, and I'm a privileged middle-class white kid who grew up in Los Angeles and was afforded all sorts of opportunities and privileges. And so the idea that he was this rags to riches story deserves some reflection, and why we want to see him as such.
Well, there's a lot there. If I get you back one day, I'd like to ask some more questions about Tom Brady and all sorts of other subjects. Paul Schneiderman again on Sportsman Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio with Professor David Leonard. Professor, real quickly, right about the quarterback position in your book, Plain While White, and there was an interesting New Yorker piece about Josh Rosen. He happens to be a Jewish American, Caucasian, and how there's a stereotype of the quarterback being like the Brett Favre kind of guy, the perfect-looking white Christian kind of guy. Do you think that African Americans and other people of color are being discouraged from playing the quarterback position? Elaborate on that for a minute.
So there's a long history. There's a long history in terms of what I talked about, positional segregation. There's a long history of black athletes being pushed into other positions, or black football players, better said, being pushed into other positions. And the article that you mentioned was really fascinating, because I think
I thought
got
so too.
at this idea of how we define and imagine this quarterback, and how race and ethnicity and religion and sexuality fits of how we imagine the person fulfilling this role. And so there were questions raised in terms of whether the critiques of Josh Rosen, whether people didn't see him as the quarterback, was tied up to his Jewishness. That the arguments and these arguments can also be seen with black NFL players who talked about going to med school, or Myron Rolle, who was a Rhodes Scholar. But you have these players who are described as not being about football, that their lives aren't about football, that they have other interests. Actually, this has been a critique directed at Serena Williams and Shaquille O'Neal back in the day. That the lack of single-mindedness is a source of critique. And with Josh Rosen, it very much played into these long-standing stereotypes about Jews, that his focus was elsewhere and not on football, that he lacked the requisite toughness. And I thought it was a really fascinating article, because it linked that to a larger history of black quarterbacks.
I do too.
And then lastly, the article does a really nice job, and also encouraging us to think about the privileges that he's afforded, that his critiques of the President of the United States, his discussions about exploitation of college athletes, his discussions about race, while raised some issues with people, he was not critiqued in the way that black athletes have been critiqued, have been told to shut up and play. And so it's this fascinating reminder of intersectionality in the way in which different identities interface in unique ways.
Fascinating analysis. Your analysis on the quarterback is fascinating. I agree with you. I thought that New Yorker piece earlier this year was very interesting about Josh Rosen. Real quickly, Professor, believe it or not, we have about 2 minutes left, so I want you to give me a quick answer on this. The Baseball Hall of Fame discussion comes up, and Roger Clemens, Alex Rodriguez, Barry Bonds have been linked to performance-enhancing drugs. Do you think Clemens, as a white guy, is given preferences at all in the Hall of Fame discussion over, say, Bonds or Rodriguez? I've never seen it. Am I naive? Am I missing something?
Specific to the Hall of Fame, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and this is where we get into the complexity of race, is in the case of Clemens, if we looked at the individual narratives, there's surely uniqueness in each case, and race is going to matter. But also with the Hall of Fame and steroids, they're also treated as a group.
Right.
And so just because Clemens also has not been admitted into the Hall of Fame or voted into the Hall of Fame doesn't mean that race doesn't shape the conversation about performance-enhancing drugs and steroids in particular ways. And I'll just say one of the elements that is important to add to the discussion about performance-enhancing drugs is the way that the history of racial segregation in baseball should influence our discussion about performance-enhancing drugs. Yes, in the 1930s and 20s and before, there weren't performance-enhancing drugs per se.
Professor, hate to cut you off.
Segregation
Professor,
was a performance enhancer.
Great insights. Hate to cut you off. We got less than 30 seconds left. What does the future hold for?
I just think race plays a significant way in all of our conversations, and we need to reflect in important ways.
Real quickly, what does the future hold for Professor David Leonard?
What's the future hold?
Yeah, what's in the future for you?
Continuing to do this work and have these important conversations with like you. I think as we've seen in recent years, sports matters beyond the field.
I really enjoyed having you on Sports and Stuff, Professor. That's you and I stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.